Hey, Howard Jacobson here. Welcome to today's Plant Yourself podcast. A quick reminder, this podcast is free for everyone and supported by patrons. So if you would like to find out about becoming a patron of the show and helping us out, helping defray the cost, helping to spread the message, you can do so at plantyourself.com/gift. Thanks so much and enjoy today's episode. Hey, welcome to Plant Yourself. I'm your host, Howard Jacobson, and today we're going to be talking about the incredible book, Mind in Motion by Dr. Barbara Tversky. So today's a little bit of an unusual format for the show. I heard about the book Mind in Motion from my friend Glenn Murphy, who's been a longtime friend and martial arts instructor and science advisor and multiple guest on this show. And frankly, there was a bunch of stuff in that book that I didn't really understand from a sort of neuroscience perspective. And so I invited Glenn to be on the podcast with me to talk with Dr. Tversky about her work. And long story short, you can think about the phrase, I have a body, right? So what does that imply? It implies that I am not my body, because anything I have isn't me. I have, socks, thoughts. I have an itch. I have an office. And so there's this split in our Western worldview that, like, between the body and whatever I am, or I is, that the body isn't. And you might think this is all like philosophical bullshit and totally irrelevant to your actual life, and you might be right. But one of the consequences of thinking that our bodies and minds, or our bodies and our identities, are distinct from each other is the way we treat our bodies as second-class citizens, right? So in this society, physical labor is not as well paid, not as highly regarded as intellectual labor. We exercise. Why? So we don't get weak or sick or look bad. And so the purpose of our bodies for many of us is just to carry our minds around, to carry our I around. So we take care of our physical health the same way we take care of a car that we needed. And today's guest, Barbara Tversky, who's a professor of psychology both at Stanford and Columbia Universities, has spent her professional life questioning this primacy of the mind over the body. And this book, Mind in Motion, argues that our abilities to think and perceive originate in our bodies, and more specifically in the process of movement and feedback from the environment. In other words, all thought is actually spatial thought. And we're going to talk about the way our language encodes that. And once you start looking at language from Dr. Tversky's perspective, you see it everywhere. So if you want to grow and evolve, books and philosophies are fine, but challenging your physical body with new sensations and with challenges is a far more powerful engine of evolution. We also used this episode for Glenn's Systema for Life podcast. You can find a link to that in the show notes, which is plantyourself.com/431. All right, let's get this thing going. Glenn Murphy and Barbara Tversky, welcome to Plant Yourself, and I guess, Glenn, to the Systema for Life podcast as well.
Lovely to be here.
Yeah. So this is an exciting conversation about, Barbara, your book, Mind in Motion, How Action Shapes Thought. And I would love, so Glenn, you introduced me to the book and helped me think through a lot of the concepts. I'd love for you guys to just take it away, and I'll jump in as my curiosity dictates.
Yeah, great. And Barbara, it's so wonderful to meet you today and to get to see the personality behind the words. It's just incredible for me reading the book and just sort of seeing how much richness and depth was in there. You can read it 4 times and still come out with new things, I find. So highly recommend immediately anybody who hasn't read it, get your nose in it as soon as possible. So the central concept of the book is that spatial thinking is the foundation for thought, right? It might not represent the entirety of all thought and how it comes about, but it's the foundation. And that's, in some ways, that's quite a revolutionary idea. And in some ways, it's been around for a little while. And I'd like to get into the details a little bit if we can. But first off, what inspired you to write the book? What need did you see that this book filled?
So it goes way back to when I was a graduate student. I was always interested in the visual spatial world. I grew up in a family of artists, and I dabbled with art and architecture. It was something I was always aware of and enjoyed. And when I got to graduate school, it was dominated by language. Everybody thought thinking was in language or language-like propositions. So that view came from philosophy, it came from linguistics, it came from psychology, it even came from introspection, that when we think about thinking or talk about thinking, we use words. But then where do the words come from? The thoughts precede the words, and the thoughts we can't grasp. And then I started thinking about the visual spatial world, and we can recognize thousands of faces instantly. We can't begin to describe them.
Yeah.
The same with emotions. So those concepts that are so crucial and central to our lives aren't verbal concepts. And then I started thinking about the brain, and half the cortex is in one way devoted to space, because space is multimodal. It's not just visual. We know about space from hearing and from touching and from all of our sensory modalities. Half the brain is devoted to space. Yet another, babies do incredibly intelligent things before they can speak. And when they start speaking, everything seems to begin with ba. Bus, banana, bottle, right? And so you hear them say ba, ba, ba. It's not a deep dive into their thoughts. So, and they're doing intelligent things. Animals are doing incredibly intelligent things. So that thinking can't be language.
Sure.
It occurred to me that there was that space preceded language, spatial knowledge preceded language, and that, if anything, language was built on that and not vice versa. And so for many years, the work I was doing, I kind of, post hoc, it looks very planned, the research program I eventually carried out, but it was really quite intuitive, finding areas of spatial thinking, visual thinking that language couldn't do. And showing those one after another, but it became coherent after a while, and then intentional. But it seemed to me that we needed to understand how people thought it and dealt with space, that was different from language and important. But because it was space, people marginalized it. They thought it's like music or smell or something that's peripheral. It's not central cognition. And I think what cinched it as central cognition was the Nobel Prize awarded to O'Keefe and the Mosers for their work on finding place cells in the hippocampus and an area next door that mapped the place cells spatially. And that caught the attention of people. If it's in the brain in that organized way, that's really quite remarkable, then maybe it's not so peripheral. Maybe it's so that, I think, changed things on the agenda of scientists. Now there are huge numbers of people looking at the brain substrates and more paying attention to the behavioral. But it's been a struggle to get recognition. I'm really gratified that you found it. And I'm wondering, how did you happen to come across that book?
To be honest, it was literally just a recommendation after having read other works in cognitive science, and they're like, if you like that, you might like this. So I'm very ashamed to say that an algorithm probably steered me towards this book rather than my deep dive into research and finding out exactly who was leading all of it. And I think I've been nodded towards it a few times, but I just never fully appreciated the depth of the work. I'd come across little bits and pieces. I think probably one of the big steering I'm just trying to think. There was another book that I was that referenced it quite heavily. I'll have to pull it back in and put it in the show notes at the end of it. But there was one book in particular that was talking about spatial awareness and some of the research that you'd done and how that fed into the central concept of the book. I think actually it might have been one about Aboriginal thinking and how people in indigenous cultures use kind of sand talk and spatial metaphors in order to describe movements of things through time, in order to describe ecosystems, like to map things in different ways. And the argument was that we've lost something in our kind of obsession with words and getting things across verbally, and that in some ways we're very, very kind of stupid compared to some indigenous cultures who are extremely well integrated into their ecosystems and seem to transmit kind of practical knowledge very, very quickly using images and just kind of circumventing the verbal kind of that way. And I think that might have been it. I can't remember the exact book, but it was it, and that kind of set me to thinking like, okay, what have we lost and what did we have? And surely, especially before the printing press and where oral cultures were, pretty widespread, but still people didn't rely solely on words all the time. There was a lot more gesture. There was a lot more action. And also, if you think about kind of the cradle of civilization, and anywhere in Africa now, there's thousands and thousands of languages, right? And any given person has trouble communicating even with somebody about 40 miles away, there's like so many different dialects. And the gesture and action and body language must have preceded the ability to make contact with anybody beyond your immediate kind of tribe and area in order to try and kind of, find support, make trade, build community, do all the things that we most certainly would have had to do as humans, right, through history. So there were so many little threads that were tied together that made sense. And it was kind of the same thing. I think I've been kind of chasing this little God in the gaps argument of like, oh no, we think in words, and I've read some linguistics, some other stuff like that, and Chomsky and Steven Pinker and different things like that seem to suggest some of the opposite along the way, and it never really resonated with me. And then as soon as I started reading in these other ways, it really did. So I'm interested in. So when you said that you met some resistance, or it was difficult to kind of get it, and then eventually you hit some sort of speed, some hump, and now people are kind of accepting the ideas a lot more. What was the lines of the resistance? Was it just that people were so convinced that verbal language was so much more important that it held some other kind of level of importance in the brain relative to just simple space and coordination?
Yeah, no, I think it's that, and that it was sidelined. It wasn't so much resistance, although I got a lot of resistance from early work that I've done showing that our concepts of space are distorted and theoretical. That met a huge amount of resistance, and within the spatial cognition community, it's still resisted.
Sure.
And I think they're just myopic. Use a visual metaphor, right? For thinking. No, I think it was more that it was ignored. And then many things happened at the same time. Some people in studying language started studying gesture, and gesture had been thought to be the bastard child of language, that it was an add-on and irrelevant because, after all, we can communicate on the telephone, we can communicate through written language, so who needs gesture? And who needs intonation of voices? And that sort of thing, which isn't in written words. So I think, and gradually the work on gesture became to be recognized partly through studies of a colleague of mine at Columbia who asked people to sit on their hands and then describe things in space, and people couldn't find words. So
especially if they're Italian, presumably. So.
We can get to, and even then, it was gestures are for finding words. They aren't for thinking. I think by now my friend and colleague Bob Krause is convinced that gestures are for thinking, independent of language and maybe prior to language, but the inroad came with gestures are needed to find words. And now that looks a little curious because it's so clear that gestures help my thinking and help your thinking.
Sure.
But we can do without them. And the miscommunication is greater when you don't have intonation and these analog channels that are different from words. And that's another remarkable feature of the human mind, is that we can use language to imagine space and to imagine movement in space. So I can give you directions how to get somewhere, or in your case, what to do with your body, yoga, and that sort of thing. I can tell you in words how to do it. I can even tell you in words what you should be feeling inside your body, and that helps draw attention to it. So the human mind can trade off, not completely, but because we can describe physical situations in words, and then we can use words to understand real physical situations. So the human mind is quite remarkable in that trade-off. And again, that was something we studied early on, that we can describe elaborate spaces and people can imagine them and can imagine moving in them and can imagine changing them just from language. But even that relied on knowing about space.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we couldn't have made those connections, hooking one up. So another thread on language, and your comment about Aboriginals, and I think I know where that research is coming from. I think it's coming from Steve Levinson's lab, looking at spatial cognition in many different communities and arguing that they use an external frame of reference and that they're better located than we are.
Yeah.
But even there and in our own language, we see the use of spatial terms in describing almost anything else. That we certainly share with people who don't go to school, and we share it with. So the holidays are coming up, we're approaching the holidays. Yeah. Or the holidays are behind us. Those are all spatial terms. We've grown closer or far apart. Everything's in chaos or upheaval. Those are our spatial or visual or sometimes auditory terms, and our language is filled with them. It's very hard to speak about anything without using spatial words to describe more abstract concepts.
I thought one really interesting concept in the book was that you pointed out that human communication systems are redundant, right? That we have what people know and understand to be body language. People understand that your legs do certain things, and I teach this in stress-proof courses too, how like you can talk to somebody if you're maybe catching them on the way out of the room or something. If they don't really want to talk to you, they'll turn their torso towards you, but their feet are still pointing towards the exit where they want to go, right? And they can feign interest, and they'll be like, that's fascinating, I really do want to talk to you about that. But their legs are saying, I want out of this conversation. And if you can learn to read those cues, then you can understand the person better. And this idea that because the body has redundancy, that you can lose one thing and catch up with another, as you said, and the key examples being that people who are blind can get full context of emotion from intonation of voice and things like that. They can infer it, but so can deaf people. Right? Deaf people can read your emotions from gestures and facial expressions and body movements a lot more. Right? My sister is deaf completely in one ear and partially in the other, and she lip reads so well that you wouldn't know that she was deaf. And the only way that you can actually not communicate with her is if you scratch your face or something in between, but like her voice doesn't give it away, nothing does, right? And so she's amazing at that, and people just don't know, they have no idea, right? So that's amazing to me. But I think what most people probably intuit is that we have body language, and we have these things that we do to communicate, but they're hierarchically they're underneath words and language. Like given the choice, we would always use words, and that we only resort to space and gesture when we have to. We don't have words, right? I feel like there's like an implicit bias there in most people's way of thinking. But in a very real sense, what you're saying is that because the spatial thinking precedes the ability to form the words and form the thoughts and then get them back out again, it's never really independent of space. Am I right in thinking that, or is that an overgeneralization?
I think you're right, and we aren't aware of the gestural and intonational effects of others on our own thinking. But in this way, we aren't really aware of choosing words. They just pop in our heads. Now, if you're speaking a language you don't know well, you're aware of looking for words. But once you're fluent in a language, the words just come the way the gestures come, and the intonation comes, and we aren't aware of it, and we aren't aware of it in other people that we're attending. Yeah. And that's changing the meaning. I can change the meaning of a sentence by an ironic, she's beautiful.
Yeah. Incredulous. It's like,
it totally changes the meaning. And I talk to my lawyer friends and say, how can you rely on transcript? court proceedings or transcripts of anything. They're losing so much of the meaning because so much of the meaning is somebody's hesitant, somebody's frightened, all of that. Somebody's excited. We pick that up in a way that isn't captured by words at all. But I think we don't have awareness, and you make me think that some of the reason why we're so much aware of words is they're harder to understand. That decoding them and decoding syntax, the words in this complicated syntax that in spoken languages is not upheld. We interrupt ourselves, we break syntax all the time, so that comprehending a sequence of words is just so much harder, takes so much more cognitive effort than unpacking intonation or unpacking gesture. That happens almost effortlessly, that we're embodying it. And some of that embodiment might be the internal mimicry that we have, that human beings naturally mimic other people's gestures, other people's facial expressions, other people's body positions. Somebody straightens up in a meeting, everybody straightens up. Somebody yawns, everybody yawns. That those things, those aspects of communication are mimicked in our bodies so quickly that, and that helps the understanding. That mimicry, motor resonance, is sometimes called the mirror system. So, and with words, and we certainly do some of that. There's a whole theory with evidence that we understand words by attempting to replicate them in our brains. And I have a good friend, brilliant person, who he's like many of us, not 25 anymore. And when we speak, he's saying what I'm saying. So if I'm speaking, he's saying what I'm saying out loud. I hear it. And I think that's a way, by articulating it himself, he's understanding it better. So some of us do that implicitly, but I think that mimicry of other people helps us understand, and it's more immediate with these so-called embodied aspects of behavior than it is with the verbal.
Gotcha. Howie, I think you had a question about resonance, right? Motor resonance we were talking about before.
Well, I mean, I think of a lot of this in terms of sort of our evolutionary survival strategies. So, that we have the same, internal wiring, let's say, as the springbucks and the gazelles at the watering hole, who all have to be attuned to each other for the group to survive, right? So that it makes sense to me that we would be natural readers of posture, of energy, of gesture, of sound, even, sound preceding language. I mean, so I guess partly it feels like, especially like I'm reading pages 184, 85, where you, in case you haven't memorized.
Is there going to be a test? I didn't realize there was going to be a test.
In the hardcover edition, you have a game where you list all these words, and you ask us to come up with a literal and essentially a metaphorical use of the word, like hear or crumble, right? That the fact that, like, it feels like a con that language is trying to pull on us to make us say that language is the most important thing, and it obfuscating the physiological basis of our survival. And at the same time, every single word is pointing to this thing. And it reminded me, I don't want to exclude Glenn here, but another Hebrew word that comes to mind is the word olam, which means world, like the universe, everything. And it also means hidden, that which is implicate and not manifest. And I'm thinking, how are we using language to hide the fact that language is less important? It reminds me of one of my favorite comedians, Emo Phillips, had this line. He said, "I used to think that the brain was the most important organ in the body. Then I realized who was telling me that." Right, has language tried to pull a fast one on us to hide its dependence on embodiment?
Yeah, and I like the way you opened, especially. Gazelles need to understand other gazelles, and I think this is an understudied aspect of humanity. Cognition, even social cognition, has been so much between the ears and the brain that's telling us that it's the most important organ. And joint action, coordinating with other people, has been neglected, and that's changing. I think that's one of the most exciting research areas, is looking at how people coordinate, and even looking that people can't not coordinate. You're sitting next to somebody, and your simple job is to press buttons when certain lights come up in the computer, and the person next to you has to do the same thing, but their mapping is different. They do different things with their fingers when the lights come up. If their mapping is different, you're slowed down. If their mapping is the same, you're speeded up. You can't see their screen. It's a kind of, you can't help but be aware of the other people and what they're doing. You think in a waiting room for physicians, people automatically make room for each other, move aside, adjust their behavior. In every situation, Grand Central, now it's empty, but before March, it was packed with people who almost never collided. So, and we make those decisions instantly. We see somebody's in a hurry, we make way. Or somebody's disabled, we slow down. There's a whole set of social norms, and I'm aware of this as a woman, who goes first. And there are cultures where the man goes first, and there are cultures where the woman goes first. So and those things happen. So even babies, you look at how do you interact with babies, and the baby says yeah, and you say yeah, and the baby says yeah, and you keep imitating each other, and then you turn it into a game. After you've got that going, you say yeah, yeah, and wait for the baby to do it twice. So that, and it's fun. It's a game, but it's teaching the baby a lot. It's teaching the baby to coordinate their actions with you, which they're naturally wired to do. And it's teaching them to trust you. So you roll a ball back and forth, and the baby doesn't want to give you the ball. But the baby learns you're going to give it back. And then they give it to you and they give it back. So you learn trust. And those simple games set the really coordinating in time and space, doing the same thing, like rolling a ball back and forth, doing complementary things where you're clapping and each one is doing slightly different things, or I give you something and then take it. So complementary, those are the basis of human cooperation.
I've got a really, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've got a really interesting aside on this one. And that, again, I mentioned earlier that I teach kind of like a martial arts practice, or like a way of understanding other people through movement, essentially. And the methodology is Russian. It's from Systema. And it's very interesting because it's informed by Soviet-era physiology and psychology, right? And some of it from Leonard Bernstein and his work on how dexterity develops and all of those things, and the kind of areas or levels of complexity in how we interact with each other. And one of the key drills that we do, we call the flocking drill. And so if I describe this to you, maybe you can give me your take on what's going on in a sense, is that we have maybe 10, 12 people in a room, and they're all walking in a circle in the same direction to begin with. And then I just tell everybody to pick a central point in the room and walk through that point and to the other side of the circle. And then when you get to the imaginary circle boundary, turn around and walk back. And everybody walks through the circle, and the first time it's kind of self-conscious, and it's like being at Grand Central Station, like, oh, excuse me, and everybody does like the tango where they both dodge the same way. And within literally 5 or 10 seconds, and Howie can attest to this because he's done this drill many times as well, everybody just starts flocking like birds. As soon as you stop trying to pay attention to any one person, you defocus your vision and you stop attempting to focus on individual things or people, you just naturally flock and move through people. If you just imagine you have somewhere to be, you can just do this drill indefinitely and nobody hits anybody else. The only person that hits anybody else is somebody who's feeling stressed or self-conscious and they're kind of too wrapped up in themselves. So if you kind of cede control of your mind and your body to this spatial sense and just trust it, then it manifests itself very, very quickly. But and the basis of this self-defense form that we have is that actually most of the time what people do, if you're physically approached or threatened, usually you either freeze, right, standard fight, freeze or flight thing, and you stay still and that makes you a target, or you clash with it. Or you just run away like this way. And the basis of our methodology is essentially just in training. Like you entrain your body to the other person. If they step slightly to the right to try and get an angle, you kind of do the same thing. And what this does is not just create kind of better angles for escaping or moving or fighting. It actually makes the other person in an odd way feel like you shouldn't be fighting anyway. It makes them feel relaxed because you're not behaving in the typical ways that you would expect if there's an aggressive encounter. And this enables you to control the person without using as much physical force. So in that kind of way, in your book, you kind of break down different areas of the brain that relate to different aspects of spatial cognition, right? And there's one in which we label objects and things in our environment. There's one where we sense and label internal sensations in the body, like the boundary within your skin, right? And then there's another which just takes in the scenery around you. And provided that nothing changes, we're kind of fine with that. And that creates change blindness and a bunch of other things too, right? We say, okay, I'm in the gym or I'm in the garden. I know where I am and how I'm supposed to behave. Now I can focus on other things and I just ignore everything else. But what's happening in that interaction is you're noticing other people, right? You're noticing their bodies and their changes and their directions. And you're adjusting yourself on the fly to this. Now, this, in terms of calculations, if you had to stop and think about all of these things, or your brain, surely the processing speed would be ridiculous. I mean, I can't imagine somebody programming AI robots to do this very effectively, or something like that. So what's actually happening? What's the primary mechanism when people do that, when they flock, like effectively?
Yeah, I'm wondering what you mean by flock, but
it's not moving the same way. It's moving around each other, but without. So you're acknowledging the other person's body and their movement. And I think you mentioned in the book that there are different areas for bodies that are static versus a body in motion, right? That we see that in a different, slightly way. So is that what's happening? Do we cede control to that one part?
Right, and again, that's going to be on the level of perceptual motor coupling without into anything elaborate that is controlled thinking. Right, and so you confuse me on flocking because I can't help but think of birds all going in direction,
sure.
A school of fish, and that's quite different.
Maybe mingling is a better word than
and it is amazing how easily and quick. Every once in a while I get on the crowded sidewalks of New York, you come to a person and it's not clear who's going to go which way, and then you kind of do head motions, right? I'll go this way and you go that way, and there are norms for that too, that in cultures that read, Western cultures that read from left to right, on the whole you go to on the right side or drive on the right side, and so you avoid people by going to the right. Right, that's a cultural thing. I don't know if you'd find that with your groups merging, but in Japan, the norm is to go left. And you go, the escalators are on your left and so forth. So but they're aware of Western, so there's ambiguity there. And in UK, I find ambiguity because they drive on.
I'm the same, yeah. I'm from the UK. I learned to drive on the left, and now I've lived in America for 13 years. I don't think there's any particular valence to it when I do the drill. It's just purely what's happening, and then just an adjustment happens, which is based on predicting the path that the other person's taking. But there's no conscious effort required to look at that path and extend it in time. We're just reading subtle cues of like which way is the shoulder moving, where do they seem to be. And it reminded me of the experiment you talked about in the book where they had basketball players watch people taking free throws, and you'd still shoot the video either when it was about to go in the hoop or when it was halfway, or even when you were about to release the ball. And even just by looking at the hand motion, they could tell with fairly good accuracy which shots were going to go in and which weren't. So we learn to read these subtle cues on a level that we don't even really understand. And the more I've taught and trained in this method, the more I've realized that it's a series of undoing, that you're actually trying to carve away the layers of extraneous thought that are getting in the way of us doing these things. It's almost like our innate ability to move through our environment that we've enjoyed probably for thousands of years is being suppressed by this kind of this insistence that we have to stop and think about everything and consider it very, very carefully in minutiae kind of things. There's something like that going on, I think. So.
I don't know how much of it is suppressing language, is learning new skills that you haven't learned, and the martial arts would be an example. And I just want to go back to avoiding people in the streets.
Sure.
Start looking, because I know Americans go right. When two people are meeting, there's a tendency to go right, and I feel that when I go to Japan, I'm wanting to move to the right of people coming to me, and they're wanting to move to the left, and then we collide. So
okay.
learn to be Japanese. So it counted. I mean, in the streets of London, everywhere it says "look right, look left."
Sure.
Exactly, because that looking behavior crossing the street, which we're not born with, right?
Sure. That's primarily for French people who come over. I grew up in Kent, right 20 miles from France, and people would come across on the train, or not even driving, pedestrians, and then they would go into the road, look the wrong way, and then get mown over by a car. So they painted that on all the streets to stop Europeans from the mainland getting run over.
In English, though, not in French.
Yeah. I mean, you got to keep imperialism. I mean, so.
And as a generic language, no, I have a friend who was killed that way. So those things we're not born with, but we learn quickly. And in many skills, like learning tennis or learning golf or learning your martial arts, you start with language until it becomes embodied. Typing, by the time we're experienced typists, we don't know where the keys are. If I ask you, where's the X key? Okay, where's the X key?
I just moved my finger.
Bottom left somewhere. Yeah.
The X key is here. It's on the left ring finger.
Right. So that's the only way we know where it is. But once we were looking at the keyboard and mapping it and slowly. So I think it's not so much that language gets in the way, as those are skills that have to be learned. And they can take years of practice. In basketball, like the expert basketball players are reading the field, knowing where everybody is, and trying to fake people by their actions. Their teammates, they're intending. But we learn, and some of that we learn very early. So how do I know? You see babies crying when they're picked up and moved toward the bedroom. Right? They've learned that moving toward the bedroom means they're going to be taken away from the company, and they don't want to be taken away from the company. So they burst into tears, which is the only way they can communicate at that point. So, but we learn the meanings of those actions quite quickly, and they become automatic, like or. So, yeah, I mean, and they have to. Otherwise, I mean, you must. And the people that over-intellectualize, like what key in the piano, and should I play it soft or sharp or quick, or even in your martial arts, the people that over-intellectualize and don't let go, and and let their bodies do the learning. I mean, I did enough gymnastics as a kid that standing on my hands, I know that the body, I'm not going to control it. The body's going to make the adjustments that let me balance. Yeah. And I got to trust the body on that. So
I think there's also there's an intuition that people have different ways of absorbing or learning things, right? And maybe this comes from kind of Gardner's work on different intelligences. Parts a good amount of which, or some has been kind of a bit discredited since, or that's been extrapolated to areas where it probably didn't apply all the way across. But I think there's this idea that people really are, that some people learn better verbally, other people learn better kinesthetically or visually and things like that. So there's some of the resistance that I can anticipate to this argument, or when I've started talking about it, it's so much of thinking is spatial and it just relies on this foundation, is people say, yeah, but not me. Like, I think in words, right? I think in words first. And you had that beautiful example in the book, I think it was Richard Feynman or something, that said that when he was taught about that, he had a friend who was a mechanic that said, you know that crazy shape of the crankshaft in an engine? And the guy's like, yeah. And he goes, what did you tell yourself when you just described that to, when you just described that to yourself, or something like that, right? And then that was his light bulb moment that, oh yeah, like some thinking is just imagery, or it's just spatial and it's not verbal. Like, but it seems to me that you could interpret your book as sort of saying, proclaiming that we're all primarily visual or kinesthetic learners, right? That we have to learn through interaction with our environment, and that feedback loop between sensation, action, and like feeling while you're doing kind of thing, and that nobody is at heart a verbal learner. Is that an overinterpretation of kind of what you're saying in that book?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no evidence that some people are verbal thinkers and some visual. There's no.
Sure. Yeah.
I like to say that I'm a kinesthetic learner. I mean, we all have those capacities in us. But we have those trade-offs where we can use language to imagine space. We can learn language to learn how our body should be positioned and what it should be feeling and where. Those connections may take a long time. But we all have some capacity for going back and forth, and it's partial. So each modality has its own special contributions. So there are clearly things that deaf people miss, that blind people miss. If they're blind from birth or deaf from birth, there are certain aspects of the world that they might be missing. When people become paraplegic, there are certain sensations and things that they may lose. So there's overlap and connectivity amongst those modalities. Yeah. It's special contribution. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in everything you've been talking about from, I guess, a cultural perspective, and think like when you talk about the basketball players who are experts or highly trained, or the typists who move beyond the intellectual into the embodied. There are cultures in which certain things are taught so that by the time you're 10, you're an expert in them. So, like Raymond Gibbs did work with on embodiment and cognitive science around like this word. The Anlo Ewe tribe have this word seses lalame, which is sort of an internal sense of balance, like feel and flesh inside, that every one of that culture had developed. And I'm questioning, we're in a culture that has become so heavily intellectualized and disembodied in the language that we're using, that we are, in a sense, beginners we're beginning typists at life. A lot of aspects that would just be intuitive and would be flowing for people who see themselves less as individual. Because if I'm an individual atom, and I'm separate from everything else, then I have to calculate what everything else is going to do. Whereas if I'm entrained, which seems to be something that can come naturally, then I'm a cell of I'm part of a superorganism, which I think we're seeing a lot in yoga classes, dance classes, things where people do naturally allow themselves to become entrained. And I think we have fewer and fewer of those opportunities in this world. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
And there's only so much time in a day, and how much can we do and accomplish, and how many skills can we acquire? And people, complain about our phones that have that give us directions that nobody knows how to find their way anymore. And I say, nobody can take a square route, nobody can fix a bicycle, but we have so we give up something, but we gain certain time and efficiency from other things. There's only so much we can do. But what I will lament is, and for many, many reasons, is the absence of serious physical activity in schools, of sports where you're playing with teams, so you learn to win, you learn to lose, you learn to cooperate with your team, you learn all those movement skills of adjusting to each other, passing to each other, those sorts of skills, which I think are really important life skills, not just physical skills. And it would, in my mind, I think, prevent a great deal of obesity if kids were moving and had an hour, a serious hour of PE every day and after school activity. And I grew up that way. And I don't want to sound like an old fogey that is advocating going back to, but I think, and I watch my children and grandchildren, and I watch city people and suburban people, and the idea, I think that doing serious physical activity in schools would prevent a great deal of obesity and would keep bodies.
What I would say your book argues is I don't think anyone would disagree that exercise would prevent obesity, but I think what you're saying is that exercise would also make people smarter, more socially adept.
They learn to cooperate. They learn to win and lose. So there's emotional experiences there that are important. And there's shaking hands with the opposite team after a game, congratulating them on their whatever. It's all healthy social skills that again are going to, and they're physical, but they're going to underlie cooperation. And many businesses you see now take people off site and try to make up for the past that didn't have enough of that in order to build teams, and they use those physical activities, cooperation and teams against each other, to build the social skills that we all need to live in a society. We can't be hermits. Right?
Can I ask you a question about, just building on Howie's point about that there are benefits to physical education, as you said, especially like for kids, but I think probably lifelong as well. Like as soon as arguably we probably play sports and do things more when we're kids, or just physical games, and it tails off as you go through high school. And then unless you're a competitive sports person or you really enjoy playing the sport to win and to do other things, usually by the time we're 25, other things get in the way. You have families, you're like, oh, this is hard. And then you kind of see a renaissance of that when you have kids of your own and you have to teach them how to play soccer or run around or something like that. But there's this lull in between kids maybe, and then after kids where we just kind of lapse into a sessile existence. And of course, this is very pertinent now with COVID and people being locked up indoors. And we've seen this weird kind of balance between the fact that some people have been stuck at home, and so now they're finally like, oh wow, I really want to get outside. I feel like I'm in prison. I want to go for a walk. I want to go for a run. So there's been some small uptick in kind of physical activity from that, but then there's also been the kind of feeling of helplessness and like, what's the point? I'll just binge watch Netflix and sit here, wait for this thing to pan out, especially in America where it's never ending, where we didn't implement a decent lockdown, so it's just there's no end in sight, And I'm really interested though in not just what that does for you physiologically, because I think most people are like, yeah, if you slob around, probably your cardiovascular health is going to suffer, your bone density and other things are going to suffer. But this idea that you've got trade-offs. This was, I think, your first law of cognition, right? In everything, you gain something, you lose something. You have to trade something off, you lose something. So in not noticing details in scenery, the trade-off there is meaning. Like, I know what I'm supposed to do in this area just by recognizing that it's a gym or that it's a school or whatever it's going to be. But we don't bother looking for fine details unless we're like a Secret Service agent. We have to spot the one assassin or something, right? And you have to be trained back into that, literally. Like, I've worked with people that do that, and they're trained to see 20 things in the room as soon as they walk into it, right? Or how many of these things could I pick up and get a swing with? Or where are the exits immediately? So that's very interesting. But this other idea that action molds perception, I think it's maybe like second or third in your laws of cognition that are in there. And this idea that how we interact with the world alters our perceptions of it. So I'm interested in this idea that movement or interacting with the world or physical education isn't just for the body. It's not even necessarily just for teamwork and learning interactions with other people, how to get along with them. But it's also like it alters the fundamental way the choices that you have, as you might say, the affordances, the mental affordances increase if you have more physical affordances. And we mentioned before we started recording about Moshe Feldenkrais and like his ideas about building awareness through movement, paying very, very close attention to the feedback loop between simple actions like just lifting an arm and watching what the sensation is and putting it back down, the sensory feedback that you get, and just kind of feeling while doing, and in doing so kind of rewiring your nervous system, your peripheral nervous system, so that it fires a little better and a little bit more in more of a coordinated way, so that you become more efficient in your movements and you become what he calls more mature. And he described like babies getting up to a certain level of maturity, physical maturity, walking. And then after that point, once we learn to walk, you can kind of stop there and not learn any more coordination or dexterity than that. Or you can become a gymnast or a parkour person or a capoeirista or something, right? You can take it as far as you want. But I think he was arguing, and interestingly, Feldenkrais was also the first judo expert, first European to get a black belt in judo. He trained under Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo, and brought it to Europe single-handedly, and wrote this beautiful book called Higher Judo that argued that judo and martial arts were basically a way they were introduced by Jigoro Kano to Japan as a form of not as fighting, but of physical education for kids. That's what judo was distilled for in Japan, right? And he argued that the very, very complex dexterity required to make contact with another body, to feel the pressures that were moving, to have a shared sense of gravity and move around that point and become effortless in your movements and not just kind of struggle with people, gave you not just physical affordances in the world, but mental affordances that made you more psychologically pliable or more psychologically versatile. Have you got anything to say about that? Or is there anything in your research which seems to dovetail with that?
Yeah, no, and again, it's an area that needs more research. I can only point you to one study, and that was done by a French cognitive scientist who was a wrestler and loved wrestling. And wrestling, again, is you have to interact with somebody else's body, to sense their body, where there's give. And then you can apply pressure where there's give in that body. But it's all done through the body and it's very much three-dimensional thinking and complicated three-dimensional thinking, because it's not flat surfaces, it's bodies, and which way can they move and which way can that other body move and how can I move it? It's really quite a complicated set of... So having good spatial ability is important for many different occupations and for many different computations that the mind can do. And one of the major ones is mental rotation, imagining something in another orientation. And those tests are usually visual, comparing the orientations of two things. And it's there are people who are better at it and worse at it, and it predicts behavior in a wide variety of situations that are more it predicts understanding of step-by-step explanations. It predicts making explanations that are step-by-step of almost any kind of phenomenon. So it's an important ability, this very simple mental rotation. And it's used as the major dependent variable for measuring spatial ability. I should say there are many spatial abilities, just like many verbal ones, and that was something harking back to, are we verbal thinkers or visual thinkers? There are many ways to be a visual or spatial thinker and many ways to be. Verbal ability is not unitary, neither of them is. So this French cognitive scientist wanted to demonstrate, because he was a wrestling aficionado, that wrestling would improve spatial abilities. So he I think it was a month of practicing wrestling for novices and a month of doing various spatial tests. And in fact, the wrestling was better at spatial abilities. And he did aerobic exercise too, bicycles and that sort of thing. But the wrestling per se was a better way to boost these mental rotation abilities. That makes sense, because in wrestling you're imagining different
rotation this way as well as this way, right? In tennis, you only have to worry about, am I going left to right and anticipating a ball? But in wrestling, you can do this, right?
It's also what arms and legs can do and what forearms and shoulders can do. So it becomes much more complicated than but in a wider, so that's one way of improving the spatial ability is wrestling. But another colleague and friend, David Utall, spearheaded a meta-analysis of hundreds of studies that have attempted to increase spatial thinking. Because again, it turns out to be an important predictor in success in math, in success in science, and in other fields. So that and it's not taught in school. Teach reading and writing. We don't teach spatial thinking. We don't teach how to read maps. We don't teach how to understand graphs. All that needs to be taught, and it is. So it needs to be. And then there was a National Academy of Sciences report that came out strongly on that. I don't know how much of an effect it's had. But so it turns out that to increase spatial ability, wrestling helps, but many other things help. Sure. Almost anything you can think of that would increase spatial abilities does help increase it. And showing which things are better for all people is tricky.
Just hasn't been done.
So any of those things can help, and probably the more you do, the better. And that gets back to the issue of, are there visual spatial learners or verbal learners? When educators tried, and they try each generation to pick out the students that are stronger visual spatially or stronger verbally and match educational exercises to ability, it doesn't work. What works is giving everybody both. So variety works. And having people have many hooks to the learning, whether it's visual spatial maps and diagrams and graphs and also verbal explanations, that having more of that helps everybody. And that if you miss one hook, you'll get another hook. You'll have another. So having multiple hooks in multiple modalities for thinking about anything encourages that learning rather than trying to do this complicated matching.
Okay, gotcha. Howard, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, so for second law of cognition, action molds perception. The way I think of perception is basically its existence. Like what you perceive is like your experience, your awareness, your experience of existing, of being alive. And I think that, that argues for, like you're talking about exercise specifically. We have a very pathology-based view, like we exercise to prevent obesity, to prevent heart disease, or an attainment mentality, like, okay, well, we're going to teach people exercise so they can be better scientists, better mathematicians, more socially adept. But it feels much more fundamental that movement creates our reality, and that the more movement we do and feedback we get from it, and the more movement we coordinate with other people, sort of the more we become as beings, the more we can kind of become ourselves.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting. So it depends on what we're perceiving and what actions we're doing. So I might get very good at basketball, or I might get very good at walking New York City and seeing the different architectural styles and the way the streets are organized and the way people are moving. And I'm paying more attention to that. So it depends on a bit on, I have these behind me. I'm reading in the papers today that the museums are opening and very excited to go back to them. I can interact with paintings by, embodying what I'm seeing, feeling what I'm seeing. So what reality do you want to create? And can't do everything in our brief lives, but sure. So it's what reality and walking the streets of New York or the mountains of Italy, You can be paying attention and interacting on different levels, looking at the wildflowers, looking at the geological formations. There are so many different ways of interacting. And again, the variety is going to be good, and we can train our eyes and our ears to listen to birds. So the world is so rich and offers so much.
Right. And that's why I'm feeling like the atomization that I have felt around. So I sit in front of my computer and I am a separate individual. I was reading recently about the fake arm studies. Have you seen, what I'm talking about, where they have a mirror and one arm is yours and the other is a plastic arm, and they,
it's in the book, I believe. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So they can train you to think that something that's not you is you, which is a sort of interesting trick of empathy. But just politically, I see we live in such a fractured world where people don't share the same reality. I think training people to do things together, to move together in movements, and to interact with nature might ground us. It feels like just our culture is very ungrounded in what makes us healthy, happy, socially functioning humans. And I felt like there was so much in Mind in Motion that I interpreted as potential antidotes or potential directions for healing.
Yeah, no, thank you. And right, we are polarized, and we tend to, and people have been saying this, we live in echo chambers, and you live on one of the coasts in America. I don't know the the cities in the UK versus the country, and you end up talking and interacting with people who share your views and demonizing the other. So human beings have so much potential, both to cooperate and to fight. So, and we see that in history all over the place. And cooperating more is certainly good, and we emphasize globalization. But once resources get tight, you tend to go back into your own community. You're going to protect your people first, and if the resources are tight, you want them for you and your people, widening, and not for the other people. You see them as competitors. So those tensions both ways work, for good and for bad. And there have been many studies showing that when different groups that are usually at odds cooperate and work together on a common project, that they do like each other more and learn to appreciate each other's points of view, or avoid the conflicts that might come out of them. And I can give you lots of examples. There have been, unfortunately or sadly, studies that show that sometimes the opposite happens, that working together with groups that you may not appreciate can actually heighten tensions. So it, again, is subtle and depends on how the cooperation is based and how it transpires. But, finding ways to emphasize the cooperative aspects of humanity, I think I agree, are really important, especially now. And again, some of the issue is scarcity of resources, and that's a sad aspect of the current situation. Is people ill, people unemployed, people, and the K distribution, where the rich get richer and the poor get poor, and the system seems to be rigged that way. And people protecting their own wealth and not wanting to share it.
How much? So I had a question about that as well. Do you foresee any? I mean, our vistas have changed a lot, right? And it's not for everybody. Some people have been barely affected by this, right? They all worked at home as bankers or like, things that worked on computers all the time. So they just shifted location from an office to home. And I know people who are actually a lot happier. My friend is, 6 weeks right now in the Outer Banks, North Carolina, on his laptop, still working for Credit Suisse because, why be at home working for Credit Suisse or at the office when he can be in the Outer Banks and like drink lagers and float in the sea every evening, like after his day's work, right? So he's fine. He's doing okay, like, and the self-isolation is fine for him. Other people who have people-facing jobs are in a terrible state, and they're just very, very worried about their ability to support themselves. They don't want to be reliant on other people, but they're kind of trapped in this new vista where they're stuck at home, and this is what they're looking at. How much of do you foresee any kind of population level effects on limiting that personal vista and spending long periods of time in this two-dimensional focus, like just focusing on a screen and not getting that kind of shifting from place to place? Because you describe in the book how we know how to behave when we go into a new scene. We just kind of assess the scene and we're like, oh, these are the kinds of things I associate with being at work. Unless something has changed, I can just assume that I should get on with things this way, right? And we just kind of get on with stuff. But it seems to me now that people trying to work from home, it's not the same. It's not because you don't have those same psychological affordances when you're sitting at home as you do when you go to a place with other people who are all sharing a purpose. And the loss, not just of that place, but also of that purpose, is resulting kind of a bit of like a loss of identity for some people. They're feeling like aimless in the same way that, bereft of Google Maps, a lot of people couldn't find their way around their town anymore. It's like bereft of those routines and those places and those three-dimensional structures we built in our lives. A lot of people now aren't quite sure how they should go about their entire day. They have to try and build these artificial routines and structures just to get themselves out of bed and moving every day. And I'm not at all speaking for myself as a collector.
No, I wonder about your friend in North Carolina, especially now when there's hurricanes. Although North Carolina has been spared this time for a long period of time, because most of us need that social interaction. People are complaining they can't hug each other, they can't joke with each other, they can't. We really miss the physical presence of other people, and many people are finding ways to do that. Bars are open and people are much too close together, and you worry about but the thirst to be with other people. So you're always going to find individuals who are really happy alone and working and don't need to be, maybe need to be with one or two, but sure. Yeah, I think my feeling, and I haven't looked at surveys, but from what I read about journalistic things, is that people are really thirsty for three-dimensional contact with people, with the smells of other people and of restaurants and of cities and so forth. So and even going back to getting along with other people, I know that cities tend to be more liberal and tolerant cities tend to be more diverse and more liberal and talented. You see in New York and certainly in London that I think even more in New York, we're living with people of many different races, sizes, colors, backgrounds, education, foreign, not foreign, and we're interacting all the time. We used to be riding the trains and buses with them. I still am, even though other people are frightened of it. So again, resources are scarce. There's fear in the world. People retreat. And many did go to the country. I think they missed out on all sorts of things by fleeing. But the fear overcame them, and many of them were protecting themselves, and probably sensibly. I know older people are more at risk, but cities do tend to exactly encourage the kind of cooperation with other groups that I think we need, and they are more liberal and tolerant and wanting to share resources rather than hog them, than cultures, than situations where you're with only people of your own sort. And
Yeah.
And I think many people are feeling trapped and lose focus. So, and I wrote a short piece on this. Again, coming from spatial thinking as the foundation of all thought, we have spatial spaces, real spaces that we navigate every day inside the house, outside the house. But mapped in the brain maps our social spaces and our conceptual spaces on the same structure. So we have social spaces, conceptual spaces, spaces of morals, and so forth. And what COVID did, and sheltering in, if not being locked in, is disrupt all of those. How does it work? How do we get food if we can't go outside? How do we see the people we need to see and love to see? And observing people around me, after you figured out a way to get food inside your house, whether you dared in America to go out to a supermarket and buy food, or you had it carted in, once you settled that, what people wanted was their social spaces.
So the hierarchy of needs, right? Once they sorted survival, it goes back to we need social contact and empathy.
Maslowian hierarchy of needs, that all of it, I mean, we really crave seeing the people we needed to see. And Zoom helped, and FaceTime and Skype and all of those media help, but they aren't the same as being able to hug people and be in full 3 dimensions. But that space seemed like after the basic needs that one. And even if you go back to the basics of space and the movements that are possible in space, the most elementary movement, and amoeba can do this, one-cell creatures, bacteria can do it, is whether you approach something or go away from something. And those are inherently in humans. I can't speak for amoeba. Inherently in humans, those are emotional.
Yeah.
You approach things you like. You retract. Things that repulse you, they're pulling you back. And the things that attract you, that pull you toward them, are likable and emotionally positive and so forth. So if the basic emotions are positive or negative, those are instantly reflected in spatial actions. Should we approach, should we avoid? And for social things, that's the first thing. Do we approach people? Are we friendly and warm and opening, or do we turn our heads and walk away and avoid people? And what was terrible, in a way, about the social distancing is that it taught us to fear, to retract from people, to move away from people. If we couldn't walk to the other side of the street, we turned our heads. And it feels foreign to act toward people that way. So we learned that very quickly. I was astounded. Again, I walked New York from day one because it was safe to be outside, even if it was cold. It was safe to be outside. And I watched everybody walking to the other side of the street. There were very few people in the street avoiding each other. And that's awkward. But we learned it in days.
Yeah.
Hours, and I think we'll be able to unlearn it too. And
hopefully,
the bubbles now, or that are protected, where you are meeting a set of friends who've been careful and nobody's been ill, and you allow yourself to be 6 feet without masks with them, or 6 feet with masks, and maybe you'll eat together, so you pull down the mask. So we're slowly putting our toes in the water to do, and hoping that the virus won't rear its ugly head again. Has some places, but those needs of approaching people.
Yeah. So Howie, if you didn't mind me, I have one more question that I just really wanted to get in, because I understand you might be running out of time, but I just really wanted to ask this to Barbara, to Professor Tversky. That's just like, what do you feel like is the true value of this understanding of spatial thinking? Like, where could the idea be most fruitfully applied? Would it be in changing the way that we learn? Would it be in changing the way that we communicate to each other? Or do you foresee that understanding this in a deeper way might kind of help shift some of the paradigms of like verbal culture to kind of like a more complete mode of thinking that consciously recognizes and incorporates like images, gestures, spaces, body language, like that we don't run from it, that we all understand that we're thinking, feeling, sensing physical creatures again. Like to my mind and to a lot of the people that I work with and are in this cult of movement towards, of getting kind of back to a more natural way of thinking and moving and feeling. This seems to offer just a lot of promise, and that it might be an antidote to some of the things not only that are happening right now with COVID, with isolation and stuff, but just the general trajectory of society. I mean, even beyond COVID, we're probably going to end up having our jobs, our physical jobs, replaced by robots, and a lot of the physical reasons that we go and do things might go away. There won't be drivers anymore and stuff like that. So we're probably going to move towards a world that's probably more sessile anyway. So knowing that, do you feel like there's some innate value in understanding this now so that we can kind of prepare for a world where we're still sensing, thinking, feeling, moving bodies instead of, like as Howie said, brains in a jar?
Thanks for bringing all of that up. I mean, there are challenges to robots. I mean, self-driving cars have not been a success. All the engineers thought it would be a snap. What's holding it up is social behavior, is not understanding how people think, and robots that have to interact with people. That's, again, a huge challenge. It's not just learning to do the many skills that human beings do effortlessly. It's also learning to interact with people, which we do quite effortlessly and without a great deal of conscious effort. So what I found really rewarding in this book, again, I'm kind of tied to research and a little bit reluctant to speak beyond it because of this training that I had early on and being a hard-headed researcher. But what's been enormously gratifying to me is seeing different cultures pick up different things from the book. So the two of you have picked up the importance of movement and body to thinking and to behaving and to understanding. The people in the human-computer interaction world have picked it up. The people in design world have picked it up. The people in hardcore thinking and language have picked it up because of the language aspects. People in art, I've worked with a number of artists. I'm working with one now. And they've picked it up partly through the way that their sketches speak to them, that the artists say and architects say that they're having a conversation with their eye and their hand and what they put on the page, and words get in the way. They can draw and design and produce art, but if they're talking about what they're doing, it just interferes. It's really a well-orchestrated conversation between the eye and the hand. What's on the page and understanding that quickly in a nonverbal way. So they've picked it up. People who appreciate art and are looking at museum educators, looking at the way people respond to art. Again, it feels embodied, that you're incorporating the emotional aspects of artworks in your body as you see them. And so people in sports, it's been enormously clinicians, clinical psychologists, a number of them have reached out, and agencies, and there's a whole movement in the Netherlands on mental spaces. It's based on spatial cognition, and it's about clinical practice and understanding various problems that people are dealing with. And again, so it's been, I didn't expect this. And I mean, I'm enormously gratified by the number of different communities that saw something in that book that resonated with them. I mean, scientists certainly, because so much of science is thinking in models. Those models are visual spatial and more direct than words, in the same way that gestures are more direct than words. So it's given me so many ideas, and I wish I had another life and another 20 graduate students and postdocs to kind of carry out the research program, because there's so much left to be done. So, yeah, I'm enormously gratified by your interest and your questions. Yeah.
Well, we're so grateful. I mean, for my part, just thank you so much for writing such a rich book. I think it's going to be a classic, honestly. I think it's going to kind of be like a pivotal book that people look back to, like, and say, oh, this was a turning point in how we think about thinking. And it's, like I said, it's going to launch so many different things. So just bravo, and thank you for your dedication to sitting down and getting all of this in one place, because I'm sure it was a Herculean effort just getting all these ways of thinking about thinking down. So it's so thank you for the resource that you brought to the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for carving out 90 minutes of your life to share it with us and with our listeners.
It was a pleasure, and I get so much from your questions and your gratitude. Enormously. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. We'll let you know when we each publish, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Okay, and best of luck in your endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much once again.
All right. I hope you were edified and entertained by that episode. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the mission of the show, you can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also become a patron of the show. As you notice, there's no advertising for underwear or socks or mattresses or delivery services. This is just me and you, and between the two of us, we pay the bills. So if you'd like to support the show, you can do so at plantyourself.com/gift. If you're new to Plant Yourself, you can catch up on hundreds of archived episodes, including the show notes for this one at plantyourself.com. So what's going on in garden news? Not a whole lot. The kale is growing back. The fences are all fixed. In running news, not much running this week, although I am getting ready for a noon run today, which I'm looking forward to. I'm expecting to do about 6 miles. I would say 3/4 of it will be running and 1/4 will be either jogging or walking. I had a little bug over the weekend, so I'm hoping to not push myself back into bed. Okay, let's talk about thanks. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use Sabali Dawn, the Dance of Peace, as the theme music for the show. You can find out more about Will and listen to more of his beautiful choral music at his website, willridenauer.com. And of course, thanks to all of you Plant Yourself podcast patrons. Let's say all the names today. Here we go. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Anthony Disson, Brittany Porter, Dominic Morrow, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jean Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Christine Nilsson, Tina Scharf, Tina Ahern, Jennifer Lanowski, David Bizek, The Mysterious Michelle X, Elspeth Feldman, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colin Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Sarah Durkis, Renda Circus, Kelly Cameron, Wayne Pedersen, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzig, Dana Bedham, Gil Lacerte, David Donahue, Blair Seibert, Durana Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesen, Ruth Ann Funderburg, Misha Rosen, Michael Lorebeck, The Equally Mysterious, Tracy Z, Aviva L, Alicia Lemus, Rebecca Hughes, Val Linneman, Reiser Cinnamon, Nick Harper, Martha Bergner, Susan Ahmad, Molly Levine, Inscrutable Harry R, Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Sharp, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Kelly Machia, Deanne Norton, Bonnie Lynch, Plant Happy Oregon, Sabina Kurtzels, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Copel, Julian Watkins, Brito O'Connell, Shannon Hirschman, Linda Yacht. Home Hedegaard, Isa Tuzunwa, Connie Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Olakoski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Morani, Karen Jo Crabtree, Tanya Lewis, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin McCauley, Elizabeth Rothschild, Ann Jesse, Cheryl Dwyer, Jenny Hazelton, Valerie Peltier, Peter W. Evans, Colleen Harrison, Justin Divitt, Joshua Somerwire, Dennis Bird, Darby Kelly, Lori Fanny, Linnea Lucas, Valerie Humble, Emily Akinelli, Levy Wallach, Rosamund McAtee, Dan Picorni, Stephen Leenan, Patty DiMartino, Mike and Donna Kartz, Deanne Bishop, Bill Burrell, Gunter Schmidt, Marjorie Lewis, Kelly Molden, Trish Adams, Ian Kramer, Nancy Sheldon, Lindsay Bayshore, Gunn-Marie Hagan, Tracy Gullidge, Laura Heaton, Meg from Amistez, Rochelle Kennedy, Diana Goldman, Stacey Stokes, Ben Savage, Michael Kay, Holly Butler, David Hughes, Connie Rogers, Claire England, Sally Robertson, Parham Ganchi, Amy Daly, Brian Turville, Mark Trevor Johnson, Josie Dempsey, Karen Schmidt, Pamela Hayden, Emily Perriman, Olga Sidorowska, Allison Corbett, Richard Stone, Lauren Vaught of Edible Musings, Aaron Hasty, Sean Owen, Sagar Nayak, Erica Piedra, and Danielle Roberts for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for this week. As always, be well, my friends. All right, time for thanks. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use his beautiful song Sabali Dawn, the Dance of Peace. You can find more of Will's music at his website, willridenauer.com. And of course, thanks to all of you Plant Yourself podcast patrons. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Anthony Disson, Brittany Porter, Dominic Maurer, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Mr. Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Christine Nielsen, Tina Sharp, Tina Ahern, Jennifer Likanowski, David Bizek, The Mysterious, Michelle X. Elspeth Feldman, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Sarah Durkis, Rhymes with Circus, Kelly Cameron, Wayne Pedersen, Janet Selby. Hi, Janet. Claire Adams, Tom Franzek, Jeanette Benham, Gil Lassert, David Donahue, Blair Cyber, Dorona Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesen, Ruth Ann Funderburg, Misha Rosen, Michael Warbeck, The Equally Mysterious, Tracy Z, Aviva Lael, Alicia Lemus, Rebecca Hughes, Val Linneman, Rhymes with Cinnamon, Nick Harper, Martha Bergner, Susan Ahmad, Nolly Levine, The Inscrutable Harry R., Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Sharf, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Kelly Machia, Deanne Norton, Bonnie Lynch at Plant Happy Oregon, Sabina Kurtzels, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Coble, Julian Watkins, Breed O'Connell, Shannon Hirschman, Linda Ayat, Holm Hedegaard, Izatu Zinwa, Connie Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Orlikoski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Morani, Karen Jo Crabtree, Tanya Lewis, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin McCauley, Elizabeth Rothschild, Ann Jesse, Cheryl Dwyer, Jenny Hazelton, Valerie Peltier, Peter W. Evans, Colleen Harrison, Justin Divich, Joshua Summermeyer, Dennis Bird, Darby Kelly, Lori Fanny, Linnea Lundquist, Valerie Hummel, Emily Iaconelli, Levy Wallach, Rosamund McAtee, Dan Picorni, Stephen Lehman, Patty DiMartino, Mike and Donna Kartz, Deanne Bishop, Bill Brielf, Gunter Schmidt, Marjorie Lewis, Kelly Molden, Trish Adams, Ian Kramer, Nancy Sheldon, Lindsay Bayshore, Gunmarie Hagan, Tracy Gullidge, Laura Heaton, Meg from Mama Says, Rochelle Kennedy, Diana Goldman, Stacey Stokes, Ben Savage, Michael Kay, Holly Butler, David Hughes, Connie Rogers, Claire England, Sally Robertson, Paran Ganshi, Amy Daly, Brian Tourville, Mark Jeffrey Johnson, Josie Dempsey, Karen Schmidt, Pamela Hayden, Emily Perryman, Olga Sidorowska, Allison Corbett, Richard Stone, Lauren Vaught of Edible Musings, Aaron Hasty, Sean Owen, Sagar Nayak, Erica Piedra, Danielle Roberts, and Michael Lushton for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for now. As always, be well, my friends.